My name is Gaohen Zhang, and I'm an assistant professor of Italian studies at UBC. And I would like to acknowledge that we're gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'd like to introduce the Mobilities Group and the Center for Migration Studies first before I introduce today's speakers. The Mobilities Group looks at the mobility analysis from a humanistic, interpretive, and multilingual and culturally sensitive scholarship on both multiple and intersecting mobilities. This year, we have invited several speakers from around the world to speak to different dimensions of the mobility analysis. The Center for Migration Studies hosts our group, and it brings together researchers from a wide range of disciplines and seeks to understand and engage in debate about the causes, consequences, and experiences of global human mobility. Please follow UBC Migration on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is on the PowerPoint slide, which you see here, and is at UBC Migration. I'd also like to thank the team behind the talk who helped put together this book launch. And I also would like to mention that the Q&A session will take place at the very end of the 5 speakers' talks. However, you are invited to type in your questions during the talk or after the talk into that Q&A session boxes. Great. So now it is my pleasure to introduce to you the editor of the volume that we are examining today. And Professor Franco De Angelis is an ancient historian and archaeologist, and his research focuses on expanding the narrow story that we tell about the ancient Greeks by examining their overlooked migrations and diasporas, which represent the other half of their story. He adopts a two-pronged approach, first by paying close attention to the underlying ancient and modern historiographies to understand how the situation developed and how it can be rectified. And second, by adopting a multi- and interdisciplinary methodology that is theoretically informed. Our next speaker, our next speaker is Dr. Tama Hodos, and she will present a video clip actually for us, video recording for us. She is a world-leading expert in the archaeology of the Mediterranean's Iron Age, a period that extends between 1100 and 600 BCE. Her particular expertise lies in the impact of colonization and the construction and the expression of social identities. Her major recent publications on the topic include the Routledge Handbook of Archaeology and Globalization and Archaeology of the Mediterranean Iron Age. Our next speaker is Dr. Megan Daniels. And her research focuses on cross-cultural interaction in the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia over the late Bronze and Iron Ages. A major component of these broad interests involves interdisciplinary approaches to the study of ancient migration, approaches which help us understand human development through migration and mobility and through discrete cultures. The focus has resulted in 2 edited volumes. One is titled Homo Migrans, Modeling Mobility and Migration in Human History. The next speaker in our book launch is Dr. Thomas Schneider. And his research interests focus on interconnections between ancient Egypt and other civilizations of ancient Near Eastern and Levant and Northeast Africa, including questions of migration and ethnic identity, cultural contact, as well as linguistic, literary, and religious transfer. He is also interested in how these concepts have been shaped and appropriated by modern ideologies, such as National Socialism. Our final speaker on the panel today is a doctoral student at UBC's Department of Near Eastern and Classical Near Eastern and Religious Studies, Benjamin Winnick. And his doctoral dissertation is tentatively titled The Applications of Social Network Analysis to the Study of Greek Mystic Genealogies. Previously, he completed a master's degree thesis titled Mystic Claims to Territory in the Megarid. Yeah, so a huge thank to our panelists today for introducing to us a companion to Greeks across the ancient world. And our first speaker is again, Dr. Franco De Angelis, who is the editor of the volume. So to you, Franco, thank you.
Thank you, Gao-Heng, for your introduction and for moderating today's event. And this event would not have been possible without your encouragement and support. And your own book launch back on November 5th, 2019, with lunch served from 11:45 a.m. onwards, remember those days, may now seem to belong to another world, but it has served as the inspiration for today's event. And I also, like Gao-Heng, want to thank those behind the scenes, particularly Doug, Emily, Natie of the Center for Migration Studies for help of all kinds in organizing this event, as well as to the panelists who've given their precious time today to present. And to all of you in the audience, I know it's late for some of you in Greece and Cyprus, for being here today. Thank you very much. Now, the book we are launching here today has been a decade in the making. The research trajectory of which this book is part has been even longer in the making. And that is where I'd like to begin, to put things into context and to introduce the book more generally. Since our audience today is quite mixed with specialists and non-specialists alike, I will frame my introduction in such a way as to be intelligible to both. As with so much scholarship in the humanities, the 19th century conception of the discipline of ancient Greek history and of classical studies as a whole continues to loom large in our century in both overt and subtle ways. There were two 19th century watershed moments to note. First, the deep global impact of European colonialism, imperialism, and dominance in education, science, and technology. These things laid the essential stage on which things played out. Second, the creation of the modern nation state of Greece exactly 200 years ago in 1821 established an important beachhead on the European and world map, made possible by the immense support of the European powers, including the imposition of non-Greek royalty, starting with Otto of Bavaria. Prince Philip, the late Duke of Edinburgh, belonged to another such line of externally derived royalty of modern Greece. In other words, the Europeans invested themselves heavily in the making of modern Greece, and their strong self-identification with ancient Greece as being the origins of their civilization in the first place fused these two worlds together. The process through which this happened was dubbed crypto-colonialism in 2002, and it should not cause surprise that this term was originally coined in the context of modern Greek cultural identity by Harvard anthropologist Michael Herzfeld, before being taken up and applied to all other kinds of historical situations. Put another way, the study of ancient Greece became a prime venue for the expression of Eurocentric values, desires, aspirations, fears, anxieties to be reflected and back projected onto the ancient Greek past. The hierarchical world order of the 19th century was transferred to the study of ancient Greece. Modern nationalism built on and expanded on this colonialist coloring of ancient Greece. This encouraged a number of modern beliefs and practices with which we still grapple today. This started with the mistranslation of the very word the ancient Greeks themselves used to describe their overseas settlements, apoikiai, or literally homes away, as colonies in all modern senses. This mistranslation was first made in the early Renaissance and was greatly amplified and entrenched in the 19th century. In general, nationalist history showed little or no interest in migrants. Once they left the nation's historical imagination. Not surprisingly, a similar lack of interest extended to the ancient Greek migrants who left Greece. When they received any attention, it was only to emphasize their subservience to their metropolis back in Greece and to their general inferiority, with Greece proper representing the center of an imperial-like system that treated regions outside it as underdeveloped or undeveloped periphery. As a result, it was usually assumed, though without much supporting evidence, that fully formed ancient Greek civilization in Greece was exported to the colonies, and that Greek culture overseas completely depended on this dynamic and innovative center, viewed with awe and respect by Greek colonists, grateful to receive all sense of direction. No cultural developments worth reporting sprang from the edges of this colonial ancient Greek world. These one-sided relationships were part of a metaphorical door hinge that swung in the other direction when the ancient Greek colonies were discussed in relation to their native neighbors. There was the widespread assumption that these native neighbors were inferior and easily wowed by superior colonists, whether it be in Provence in the far Western Mediterranean, to Afghanistan in Central Asia, and everywhere in between where ancient Greeks settled, such as Italy, Libya, and the Black Sea and its approaches. The natives contributed little or nothing to shaping the development of ancient Greek culture overseas, let alone at home. In any case, the fusion of Greeks and natives and their cultures was regarded as something baneful, causing the Greeks to be debased in a way that further justified ignoring them and focusing on the purer Greeks of Greece. Racism and other contemporary issues and anxieties raised by nationalism, colonialism, and imperialism of the 19th and 20th centuries reverberated through the minds of contemporary scholarship on ancient Greece. Now, the study of ancient Greece has always had contrary warts and all voices ever since the modern subject began, through a kind of decolonization avant la lettre. But these voices were generally relegated to the fringes until well into the 20th century, when other important developments emerged that have led us to where we are today. In the 1980s, scholarship witnessed a move towards understanding the world of ancient Greece more inclusively. Part of this included the first attempts to calculate the size and number of all ancient Greek states, as with the work of Eberhard Ruschenbusch in a 1985 article that delineated the typical Greek city-state, the Normalpolis, to use his word. At the same time as this was happening, ancient Greek history's traditional canon began to broaden with the plea to study Third Greece, a term originally coined by Hans Joachim Gerke in his groundbreaking 1986 book on the smaller and less influential Greek city-states beyond the powerhouses of Athens and Sparta. Although Gerke and Ruschenbusch focused primarily on the Greek world around what is today modern Greece, their work provided a transferable framework that could be applied to other parts of the ancient Greek world, which is precisely what I did for my own research on the Greeks in Sicily soon after. As we entered the early 1990s, the move towards understanding the world of ancient Greece more inclusively continued. The best example of this is the 10-year-long program of research funded by the Danish National Research Foundation that ran between 1993 and 2003 called the Copenhagen Polis Center, led by Mogens Herman Hansen, with scholarly contributions from all over the world. The project set out to study the Greek city-state or polis wherever it was found in the archaic and classical periods, the heyday periods of Greek history that stretched in time from Homer to Alexander the Great. The results were promptly published in 2004 as a single bulky volume weighing 2 1/4 kilograms, about 5 pounds, and containing over 1,400 pages with a thickness of 6 centimeters, almost 2.5 inches. With its publication, scholars came to appreciate that ancient Greeks may have founded over 500 so-called colonies, about 1/3 to 1/2 of the estimated total number of Greek city-states in the archaic and classical periods, which may in turn have been home to about more than 40% of the total ancient Greek population. The literally other half of the ancient Greek world had now come into view with such force that it could no longer be ignored anymore. In the early 1990s, the whole subject of the Greek city-states outside of Greece was also ripe for post-colonial scrutiny. The unsuitable ways in which modern imperialism and colonialism negatively affected the study of ancient Greece began to be put intensely under the microscope. Were the natives whom Greek settlers encountered really as inferior and backwards as made out in earlier generations of scholarship? Did the so-called Greek colonies simply reproduce a culture that was fully formed first in Greece before being transplanted abroad? What were we to make of the interactions between Greeks and non-Greeks, and should they be treated with the racist overtones that earlier generations of scholars had blackened them with? Were any differences between these Greeks overseas and the Greeks of home to be labeled as provincial and treated in a generally derogatory manner? Answers to these and so many other questions started to be given late last century and have only continued since then, with the straitjacket placed around the ancient Greeks outside Greece taken off, thus unleashing a liberating effect on the subject. Decolonization of the modern world had finally caught up with the study of the ancient Greeks, opening a door onto a largely unexplored world as far as the overall narrative of Greek history goes, which still tends to be dominated by a well-established grand narrative of great battles, famous individuals and monuments, and big developments like democracy centered on the ancient Greeks largely within the confines of modern Greece. This realization coincided with another new perspective on how the Mediterranean's ecology was and is essentially micro-regional. Generally, no one region possessed all the natural and human resources it required, and this imposed mobility on its inhabitants, who were thus more interconnected and more interdependent than earlier scholars had imagined. In other words, the Greeks and their so-called colonies could not be separated from one another. This threw into stark relief the need to integrate the ancient Greeks outside Greece into accounts of ancient Greek history in a much more systematic and comprehensive way than ever before. The fields of mobility, migration, and diaspora studies have followed logically upon the foregoing development in the last decade and represent the final major development to impact the study of ancient Greeks outside Greece. The combination of mobility, migration, and diaspora studies have acknowledged once and for all the ongoing maintenance of meaningful contacts between migrants and their place of origin, and that these relationships needed to be viewed as a two-way dialogue. Just as the complexities of the ecological puzzle came to be appreciated, changes in international politics saw an opening of geographical space that positively affected the study of the Greeks across the ancient world. The collapse of the Soviet Union and Communist East Bloc in Central and Eastern Europe in the early 1990s represents one such instance. These regions were once home to ancient Greek settlements on their coasts, including Albania, Bulgaria, Croatia, Georgia, Romania, Russia, and Ukraine. Communism and the Cold War largely kept apart the scholarly worlds on either side of the Iron Curtain. But the disappearance of these barriers opened up opportunities. Now, while some of these barriers have either widened further or narrowed once again, scholars today have easier access to this former bloc and its past and present research, and vice versa. Which of course has the vice versa, thanks also in part to the development of the internet during the same time, which of course has the capacity, as we know, to transcend political boundaries. Even in the war zones of the Middle East and Central Asia, like Afghanistan, the widening and narrowing of opportunities have at times brought to light new evidence relevant to Greeks across the ancient world. One thinks, for instance, of a mid-2nd century BC or BCE funerary inscription discovered in Kandahar in 2004, containing 20 lines of flawless Greek and documenting firsthand the survival of ancient Greek culture some 200 years after Alexander the Great had conquered the region. So it is these scholarly contexts that have inspired and made this book possible. The book contains 24 chapters divided into 3 parts. Part 1 has 7 chapters that deal with ancient and modern approaches. Part 2 contains 14 chapters of warts and all regional histories. Part 3 concludes with 3 chapters bringing together wider themes, such as the role played by ancient Greeks in culturally developing the pre-Roman Mediterranean, and how Greek migrants and their non-Greek neighbors made vital contributions to making Greece itself in terms of supply and exports, ideas, and political and military challenges. While the volume's publication may be in English and published by a publisher based in 2 English-speaking countries, this masks the underlying multinational and multilingual diversity of all involved. Like the Greeks across the ancient world discussed in this volume, the contributors and all those involved in its production and distribution are scattered across the modern world in a diaspora of our own, as any such project is indeed nowadays, though we had a pandemic thrown into the mix in the final phase. And like the Greeks across the ancient world discussed in this volume, we all have our own stories of mobility and migration to match those of the ancient Greeks who have inspired us and brought us together in this common endeavor. In my own case, this volume was finalized and went into press as I moved from rural Quebec to Aarhus, Denmark, and then to London, England, before returning back home to Vancouver during a sabbatical year. But such mobility and migration were not atypical pre-pandemic. And in that, there is something for everyone in studying and appreciating the Greeks across the ancient world. Thank you for your time.
Hi, I'm Tamar Hodos from the University of Bristol. Never before has our understanding of the mobility of groups and individuals been of such significance. Take the impact of COVID-19. Consider the Black Lives Matter movement. Both are highly related to migration and mobility, but in very different ways. And these are just 2 contemporary examples that have impacted upon our own lived experiences despite our own personal migration or mobility stories. But both of them underpin how important and far-reaching the impact of migration and mobility in their broadest senses can be on much broader spectra of society. One aspect often overlooked when we think about migration and mobility today is their diachronic component. And this is where study of the past becomes so important to understanding the present and our ability to model the future. And this is where a companion to Greeks across the ancient world comes into play. Our own understandings of the movement of Greeks around the Mediterranean have changed over time. Not only does this companion volume provide an up-to-date synthesis on current knowledge, but it also provides context to the evidence itself and our interpretations of that data by presenting regional histories of scholarly development pertaining to Greek activity around the Mediterranean. The diachronic component is a major asset of this volume. Yes, from a student or scholar's perspective, succinct overviews are made very accessible. But what marks this volume from others that examine Greeks in the wider Mediterranean, even within Wiley Blackwell's own companion series, is the fact that this volume aims to highlight not only the diversity of practices of being Greek, but also how these develop and vary over time across the Mediterranean and beyond. And it does so through integrated critical assessment of ancient literary sources and material culture evidence, thereby creating an exceptionally rich and yet concise and accessible understanding in a single volume. Through this integrated approach, we are able to recognize how ways of being Greek evolved over time as well as across place. And we can see the impact Greek ways of making, doing, and believing had on a diverse range of cultural groups over the longer term. The value of this longer term understanding enables us to better recognize the very complex nature of diversities, interactions, and impacts. And it allows us to use the past to understand where complex interconnections in a later period have derived from. This is a value of us today because the spread and impact of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter protests were not the result of a recent change in working practices or beliefs. Both emerged from different forms and circumstances of mobility, and in very different ways. They highlight the incredibly complex nature of our interconnections, be they geographic ones, and beliefs and ways of doing. The sheer variability over time and place that this volume emphasizes is what will make it endure as a scholarly resource. It lays the foundations for us to reconsider the extent of the complex connections the Greeks had with themselves and others over centuries of interaction and integration. It allows us incredibly vibrant and dynamic view of the ancient world, and it allows the Greeks to be used as a model to understand how complex connections within and between groups develop over time. We can learn yet more from the Greeks today, and this volume sets out the foundations for us to do so. I'm delighted to have been a part of it.
Hi, everybody. I'm Megan Daniels, assistant professor in the Department of Sinners. So at TA, you have control of the slides, so I'll just indicate next slide when I want you to switch. So I'd like to frame my celebration of this new volume under the theme of responsibility. And I'd like to start out by just stating, I'm sure many people know this, but the purpose of Blackwell Companions and other companions and handbook series is to be the go-to source for research in a particular area, featuring a collection of scholars from a number of different backgrounds and perspectives who can summarize and synthesize all sorts of topics, theories, and methodologies in a particular area. So these types of books serve a variety of purposes, but they're often the first point of contact for researchers, from students to established scholars who are embarking on research in a particular area. So to write a chapter, let alone to map out, bring together, and edit an entire volume is a real exercise in synthesis, and it really bears a great responsibility in the orchestrating of themes and messages within these authoritative contributions. So given the purpose of companions, a companion to Greeks across the ancient world is timely, and it certainly bears a great responsibility in our current global climate, since it deals with the movements of people and the stories we tell about human migration and human groups past and present. The ways in which modern and early modern European nations, including the colonial offshoots of those nations, have linked themselves to the Greeks in a so-called Western civilization origin story has been especially felt in the way ancient Greek migrations and settlements abroad were characterized. In short, these ancient migrations, as Franco has already explained, were largely configured as mapping onto modern European experiences in their colonization efforts, with the Greeks modeled as civilizing forces that spread cultural and technological advancement around the Mediterranean, and especially the western part of the Mediterranean. And this narrative is really essential, going back to our land acknowledgement, for thinking about where we are today on so many unceded and ancestral territories of indigenous peoples. So you can see from these quotes from one of the volume's contributors, next slide, please, Leila Urquhart, who opens her chapter on Anglophone approaches to the ancient Greek world by quoting one of the most well-known classical archaeologists, John Beasley, who stated, "In the West, as in the Western Mediterranean, the peoples with whom the Greeks came into contact were at a more primitive stage of development." Urquhart's chapter is largely an examination of how the British scholars compared themselves to the Greeks by spinning both Greek migration and British colonization as a civilizing process, as summed up by her second quote. And you can see on the right this political cartoon playing off of the Colossus of Rhodes, showing Cecil Rhodes, one of these British colonizers, I'm sure his name is familiar to many, striding across Africa with a type of measuring tool to mark out British territory in this region. Likewise, Martin Mauersberg, in his chapter on German scholarship on Greek migration, states that the Greeks, and I'll quote Mauersberg, were the first to fulfill the European civilizing mission and served to illustrate the bright side of colonization. Like their successors centuries later, the Greeks brought with them the blessings of culture that almost automatically transformed the colonized. Mauersberg research brings us to an even more insidious offshoot of early studies of ancient migration that I think is really worth emphasizing because of the dangers it still holds today. And that is the notion of racial purity that once again was laid upon the Greeks in many European traditions, not just German-speaking ones. Mauersberg quotes the archaeologist Ernst Langlotz, who as late as 1963, next slide please, was writing that in the Western Mediterranean, I'm not going to butcher the German, but basically saying the first settlers were pure Greeks, Rhino-Grecian. But they inevitably occurred this blood mixing, the Blutmischung, with other peoples around them. And, there's the Greek spirit kind of, integrated with indigenous people's traditions, but they were kind of played off as prehistoric and barbarians. And this was kind of what characterized these Greek settlements abroad. And Franco's own chapter on Italian scholarship also emphasizes this creeping sense of impurity and provincialism that hung over the Greeks abroad. So just as they were seen as civilizing forces, they were also seen as less pure than the Greeks of the so-called motherland, particularly Athenian Greeks. And so these contributions are just one of the ways in which this companion is a contribution to scholarship. The first portion of this companion, you can see on this slide here, really spells out these different European approaches, which are so fundamental to understand before we even try to synthesize these complex processes of movement and interaction. These ancient migration stories were so embedded in European consciousness that they still are to some extent pervasive, and it would be irresponsible to embark on any type of new or updated story without first recognizing what narratives underpin this research. And so this companion's a real treasure trove of knowledge on these traditions, allowing and even compelling researchers to engage with the unfolding of a really complex story that is as much about ancient Greeks as it is about us today. I'd like to take the next few minutes to synthesize this book within the larger interest in ancient migrations and the position we find ourselves in today. So this narrative of colonization as a civilizing mission has been damaging on many levels. On one level, it was inaccurate and elided a multitude of social, political, and economic processes into simplistic and unidirectional notions of culture transfer. On another level, it really fueled European perceptions of others in a type of feedback loop, where European ideas of themselves as civilizers drove the construction of narratives of ancient Greek migrations, which then fed back into European thought. So taking a brief foray into the more recent past to how migration emerged as a subject of study will illustrate how dangerous the study of migration can be and the responsibilities that researchers bear when portraying human movement in the past. Next slide, please. The interest in migration in broader archaeological thought really underscores the discussion of these earlier scholarly traditions in the companions. Many of the intellectual shifts since the 19th century have followed periods of scientific revolution that have opened up new data and methodologies in the social sciences and humanities. The first science revolution in the 1850s revolved around realizations of deep time and evolutionism, as well as the numerous cultural encounters brought about by European colonization that once again Franco also touched upon. Evolution was applied to societies as well in this process, often termed social Darwinism. Next slide, please. With researchers like Lewis Henry Morgan and others propagating unilinear schemes of social evolution that were then used to classify different peoples in terms of their place along the scale, with white European Christians at the top. Migration crept into archaeological and historical studies in this period because of a number of factors. Next slide, please. But one major factor was as an expedient tool used to explain what researchers deemed to be cultural peculiarities on the archaeological landscape, such as Great Zimbabwe, being one of many examples. Assuming that indigenous peoples were at a lower stage of evolution, researchers actively wrote off past achievements via migration for more advanced outsiders. And Cecil Rhodes, whom you see here again, actively popularized this notion of Great Zimbabwe as built by outsiders in his colonization efforts in this region, which was under him called Rhodesia. It is now Zimbabwe. And this is just one of many examples in how the study of migration was used in this period. Next slide, please. I'll dwell less on the mid-20th century science revolution, which involved new methods of scientific dating like radiocarbon. In many traditions, archaeologists in the 1950s and 60s actually retreated from discussing migration because it was, surprise, surprise, considered vastly under-theorized under these new traditions of scientific and anthropological archaeology. But the third science revolution is our current one, involving mass advances in genomic sequencing, data analysis, and isotope and chemical analyses. Next slide, please. Genetics especially has really changed the way in which we understand population movements and relationships, and has renewed new debates on major processes in history, such as the migration of the Indo-European speakers, the peopling of the Americas, and the final Bronze Age migrations in the Eastern Mediterranean, which we see a study of here, the genetic makeup of the Philistine peoples. But even this phase is not without its problems and dangers. Next slide, please. And once again, we see even the supposedly sober, unbiased data of genetics used to fuel ideas of racial superiority and purity and bolster simplistic models of human movement. It's kind of like a new data, same problem scenario. Perhaps I shouldn't be surprised that genetics ended up being used in this way. Next slide, please. One issue here is that hard science needs the social sciences and humanities to make sense of this data in a responsible manner. And this companion really capitalizes on advances in the fields of Mediterranean archaeology and history that have been on the move since the 1990s, so summarized nicely in Michela Costanzi's contribution to this volume, but really all of the contributions touch on these homegrown movements within the fields of Mediterranean archaeology and history. There's really an ever-growing tradition of studying the Mediterranean and its environs as a locale of movement and exchange. And once again, Franco already kind of went over this in his introduction. And as more of this new scientific data infiltrates our studies of Mediterranean history, we need volumes like a companion to the Greeks across the ancient world to offer us the necessary frameworks for handling and interpreting this data and committing us to models that are not at best inaccurate and at worst have real dangerous social repercussions. So I'd like to once again thank Franco and all of the contributors to making this volume a reality that will serve us for many years to come. And I will pass the torch. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Franco, for inviting me to talk today. It's really a delight to see the book published, and I would like to take a more specific, maybe approach, a personal story of how I have been working with this book and give you some impressions in the following minutes. And so I called this brief presentation Greek, in parentheses, Greeks across the ancient world, because my encounter with the book has resulted from a personal book project that looks into language contact in ancient Egypt. And I was inspired to undertake that research because it is striking that ancient Egypt has never been described in pre-Hellenistic times as a multilingual society. First, there was the overwhelming self-presentation of ancient Egypt as a culturally monolithic civilization, which has nurtured an Egyptological narrative that subscribed to this representation for much of the discipline's history. And then we have Egypt also a situation where Egypt created this enduring impression of a hieroglyphic culture, eminently visible in what Assmann called the monumental discourse, very powerful in the later reception history of ancient Egypt. And in that reception history that impacted the discipline, there was simply no place for the presence of other languages, writing systems, and linguistic communities. And this also ties into the isolationist nature of Egyptology for the last 200 years. And I just wanted to put up front here this illustration here. This, of course, are the famous Memnon colossi in Thebes, the remaining front statues in front of the front pylon of the funerary temple of Amenophis III. And here we have the famous inscriptions of Greek mercenaries that in the 6th century Psammetichos II took on a campaign that led that king deep into the Sudan. So it is just exciting to realize that this simple campaign already demonstrates the amalgamation of a number of linguistic communities, an army that was commanded by generals both for the Greek and the non-Greek speakers, the Egyptians, that also contained contingents of different linguistic communities led by a king who came from a traditionally Libyan background, and they led a campaign deep into the Sudan, where they encountered dozens of other linguistic communities. So simply, playing out these concrete situations in the evidence already shows us that we have to dramatically revise our perception of the ancient world. But as you look at these Memnon colossi, what you see is the monumental discourse here. And just to mention here, quite strikingly, as you know, the king who put up this funerary temple, Amenhotep III, he had a palace built only 2 kilometers from this location, where entire rooms were decorated in the Aegean fashion, and also where we have the first evidence of place names like Mycenae and Thebes in Greece documented in the Egyptian record. So it is really essential to look and read between the lines and to revive those buried histories of those communities here. So maybe if you can move to the next slide, I just give you a brief idea here of the layout. This is just to give you a brief idea of the book manuscript of my own and the place of the Greeks and Greek in this book manuscript. So it's a comprehensive survey of everything we know about language contact in ancient Egypt. So I review the entire evidence here about language contact within the African continent with the Middle East. This takes up most of, or maybe 3/4 of the manuscript. And then there is much less documented language contact in pre-Hellenistic times with other Mediterranean languages, which also is interesting and something that comes up in some of the chapters of the book, because much of that history about different civilizations across the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and ancient Europe is actually lost to us and has been replaced by the Greeks and also their language and the other Indo-European languages over time. So here we have a brief section that deals with Mycenaean Greek and later Greek, so the linguistic side of that contact. And later I have chosen one topic, coercion and communication, a case study of foreign language communities within context of state power, that is, for a number of reasons, very appropriate in showing different approaches within the Egyptian state towards these language communities. And that is where we are able to showcase different developments of languages, from language attrition to the maintenance of language communities within a military context. And here, as I said here, I also focus multilingualism at war and peace on Greeks, Carians, and other linguistic units in the Saite army. So I also focus here on a specific context where Greeks are very visible in the Egyptian documentation. So this book deals with pre-Hellenistic Greek-Egyptian language contact in two ways. I look at the linguistic evidence of language contact, but I also look at the socio-cultural context of language contact. Maybe next slide. And so this is just here, just to give you, this is a bit much information here on one page. And I'm sorry that here some of the diacritic fonts basically were lost in this PDF, but this is an example of the evidence we have on the surface level, words that were borrowed from these languages mutually, Egyptian loanwords in Greek and also loanwords from Greek into Egyptian, and all these linguistic stories or so, they are just the surface level evidence of specific professional communities or so that generated these loans in the mutual languages, including interesting and influential mysterious etymologies, like the famous word for myth that has been claimed to have an Egyptian etymology. So we have this surface level linguistic visibility that is, of course, reduced by evidence on both sides, and shows us how little we know about these mutual engagements in many respects. And so this is the linguistic surface level side of my study. And then if you can move to the next slide, we of course have the concrete socio-cultural communities that negotiated that contact with exciting documents like this one here, an Egyptian block statue, cuboid statue, dedicated by a Greek mercenary by the name of Pedon. In the first half of the 6th century, he served the Saite army in the 26th dynasty, and he made this dedication in the Ionian city of Priene. The Greek inscription here, a bust-prophetic inscription, mentions the pharaoh Psammetichos, possibly the second, and also the particular gifts given to him by the pharaoh, a gold bracelet, Psilion Techuzeu, this should read here, and a city. Quite exciting here, where we have these glimpses of people that migrated for professional reasons across the Eastern Mediterranean, and then they left these documents of their engagement, cross-cultural and cross-linguistic engagement. And it is exciting to reconstruct these lost histories. So I just, this is, the two sides of that project where I engage with questions that are dealt with in detail in the book. And if you can just go to the book itself in the next two slides, this is here, the book. And I have actually before Franco shared the manuscript of the book with me. I already received several of the chapters, for example, the chapter on Egypt from Joe Manning, and also had checked out the book through Google Books or so to see what information I could make use of in my book project. So interestingly, I have been engaging for my own research here with all three parts of the book here. The first part that looks into approaches to mobility, and maybe the next slide, also the regional case studies and the themes. And for me, as a researcher myself, I was interested in a threefold use that this book, I use here the acronym GAAW. I'm not sure if that is something that will be accepted by our fields. But first, of course, it was essential for me to find here an overview of theoretical approaches to Greek migration. I wanted to understand the broader political, social, cultural context of Greek-Egyptian relations, also in the context that is part of the first section of the book, the context of the national disciplinary discourses that, as the previous speakers have said, were very different in emphasis and also biased in their own ways. And then the second point that I wanted to make here, I'm using this book because I want to have the most recent references on specific historical cases of Greek-Egyptian contact, such as the question of mercenaries or the economic emporia that Greece established abroad, or other types of Greek settlements in Egypt. So what is the most up-to-date state of research? And the third one, I think, which again is quite essential because it ties in the very charged stories of our disciplines. I wanted to balance certain one-sided views in Egyptology in my field with evidence that is based in Greek studies and regional studies, and that might be biased in itself, but it is, I think, important to bring these two sides of the table together and in order to assess the evidence here in a neutral and most objective way. So as you see here, engaging with all three parts of the book. And if I can just move on, just as a final note here, to the next slide here. This is, I just wanted to give you here this to think about as a final comment here, because when you go even in this specific topic, you see how all these discourses come together. The disciplinary discourses that are biased by the history of the disciplines, the national discourses that, as we saw, are also biased but in various ways, and that all want to address and actually resolve questions that were created by the engagement of these communities in the past. So I just hear from an article by Jean-Luc Fournet about Greek loanwords, loanwords of Egyptian loanwords in Greek. I found here this quote, and I just read it out to you here. Faut-il citer l'ouvrage en russe de P.V. Jernstedt, Mot d'emprunt égyptien au grec, illustrant le pan-égyptianisme fantaisiste dans tout son excès. So is it really important or necessary to cite even the work in Russian by Jernstedt, Egyptian loans in Greek, which illustrates the pan-Egyptianism, the fanciful pan-Egyptianism in all its excess? I found this quite striking because it makes a statement that reveals also the disciplinary contention that exists between Greek studies and Egyptology. It reflects most, if we were able to unwrap this, the different national scholarly discourses that also were in contention with each other. And at the bottom of it, there should be still the commitment to understanding the ancient context. And it just shows us to what extent we are in danger of losing objectivity when studying even something that seems to be as objective as loanwords in these two languages. So this is just my brief comment here, my personal experience. I have hugely benefited from the insights of the volume, and I hope that this will also lead to a change in the discourse between Greek studies and Egyptology in the future. Thanks so much, and over to the next speaker.
Okay, so thank you for those amazing presentations. They will be a bit of a tough act to follow, but here I go. The authors of A Companion to Greeks Across the Ancient World continue a trend in the field of ancient history of dismantling the grand narratives that have dominated the way we teach the history of the Greek world. Indeed, it seems like the old dichotomies of center and periphery, Greek and barbarian, hegemonic and subject states, and many other divisions that dominated our textbooks are headed for the dustbin, and rightly so. However, De Angelis and his contributors understand that you have no business destroying a paradigm if you are not prepared to replace it with something better. These authors have laid the foundations for new frameworks based on post-processual archaeology, network theory, and other methods that can account for the pulsing vibrancy, the back and forth, the give and take, and the case-by-case variation that constituted life on the geographic edges of the Greek-speaking world. Hodos attacks the notion that Hellenization was a uniform process across the Mediterranean. She does not deny that the presence of wine-drinking wares, coined currency, and the Greek alphabet at a site were signs of Greek influence. But, like a true post-processualist, Hodos bids us ask how these things were used. She answers that they were utilized selectively and always in a way that accorded with local practices, tastes, and traditions. This observation helps dispel the notion of non-Greeks as passive recipients of a more advanced culture, instead of discerning adapters of cultural influence from various sources. Meanwhile, Bernstein understands that network theory can bridge the micro and the macro, an idea critical to my own research. His acknowledgement of complex intercommunity relationships throws the entire model of metropolis and daughter city into question. I especially was interested in the idea of the oikistes, or founder, as recipient of a posthumous hero cult. The legendary founders of Greece proper are central to my research. Since the various apoikei could not reasonably connect themselves with the characters of Greek myth, their historical oikistes had to fill that role. Peterson's exploration of the cult of Heracles in the Greek Chersonese demonstrates the way that this pan-Hellenic hero, known for traveling far and having many children, became such a symbol of Greek presence and influence in the world of the apoikei. Heracles did what the oikistes could not by giving Third Greece a connection back to mythic Old Greece. Schultz deals a death blow to the very notion of a center and a periphery by showing just how central the periphery was to developments across the Greek world. Not only was the proto-empire of Syracuse an important source of resources and a center for religious, scientific, and military innovation, It also influenced Philip II of Macedon's model of monarchy, which overwhelmed the old model of the city-state or polis, and went on to dominate a large swath of the world for centuries. As someone interested in Greek ethnoi or tribal states and the federations of koina that grew out of them, koina being federal states, it is interesting to see the ways that the large classical polis like Athens and Sparta, which in the popular imagination represent the peak of Greek achievement, were supplanted by regions with a supposedly less advanced model of statehood. Ulf seeks to add nuance to the old ideas of Hellenization and one-way cultural exchange by looking at macro and micro theories of migration studies and combining them through the concept of figuration. He also looks at different types of migrants and different zones of cultural contact. Recently, I was reading Frederick Barth's 1969 book, Ethnic Groups and Boundaries, in which he argues that maintaining ethnic distinctiveness depends on a limitation of contact between various ethnicities. This is clearly a pre-globalization idea. My Vietnamese, Japanese, Mexican, and Egyptian housemates can tell you that ethnic distinctiveness can survive a lot of intermingling. Ulf recognizes that globalization is the proper lens for studying the ancient Mediterranean, and it requires subtle models of contact and influence. What I like about A Companion to Greeks Across the Ancient World is that it adds subtlety and nuance to our understanding without sacrificing concreteness. Each chapter ends on a firm conclusion. By drawing on some of the best theoretical models, this book reevaluates the relationships between Greeks and non-Greeks in the world of the Apoikiai, as well as between this world and the old Greek world of the Balkan Peninsula and Aegean Basin. Currently, my research is focused on the mythic traditions of this old Greek world, but reading this book reminded me that even the landlocked and isolated region of Arcadia did not exist in a bubble. Going forward, I will be sure to always consider the influence of Third Greece in every topic I investigate. Thank you.